So this is going to be about a emergency department makeover. How many people here have been in an emergency room? It's about everybody, okay. What's the biggest complaint you think people have about their stay in the emergency department? Wait time. That's true. That's what we're going to talk about. To use an example, our keynote speaker at lunch talked about his son going in for poison oak, I guess it was, and they had an hour or two wait, and then they got treated, and it probably took them about 3 hours. We're going to look at a change in culture that results in a change in operations. That means that person would have been there about 30 minutes. And that's going on in a number of departments around the country, so it's not anything that's sort of futuristic. It's going on now. And what we're going to talk about is how we got from one of those old style to one of the new style. It took 4 years. And that's about cultures as much as anything. Everybody know who this is? Frederick Taylor. He's sort of our founder. He wrote a book in 1911 about what it is that we're doing now. So I always have to put him up. He's kind of the progenitor. You should read that if you haven't read it, by the way. So I just wanted to sort of didactically say what I mean when I talk about culture so we can kind of all be on the same page. This is by Ravi and Schultz. Their components of culture are mission, why are we here, adaptability, how quickly can we change, involvement, and I kind of put in there formal and informal because there's at least two kind of components of involvement in an organization, the formal that appears on the organization chart and the informal that's never appears anywhere but operates most of what the organization does. And then consistency, how well we do at managing variance. This one we can't see too well. I'll give you a little bit of a verbal description of what this is. This is actually a nursing station in an emergency department. Back in here, it's behind some windows. This is a housekeeping cart. This is a hallway. This is a barrier between the nursing station and where patients are. Patients are all around the outside of this nursing station. And these things right here, can anybody guess what those are, those up in the front? Exam glove boxes, all stacked along the front of the nursing station like this, and they're all open. Anybody want to guess what they're there for? Pardon? To use? Well, yeah. We're back here, what was that? Exactly. This is culture. We're supposed to be here for the patient, right? Well, the nurses didn't want the patients to see what they were doing. If the Department of Health comes in and they see these things stacked like this, it's a major violation. That's an infection control nightmare. And moreover, the treatment rooms all have glove boxes in them. So this is up there saying, we don't want you to see us, it's them, us kind of thing. And that's a culture that operates a lot in emergency departments and I'll argue in healthcare in general. We're there for the patients, maybe not really. So that's a real overt statement of the culture in this organization. So why is culture important? Well, anybody know about NUMMI? Okay, the new United Motor Company. It was a combination, a joint venture between General Motors and Toyota. And the day that they announced the joint venture, the Wall Street Journal ran a headline, "Hell freezes over." Never thought that those two would come together. But they did come together. I'm going to make a long story kind of short here. Actually, there's a radio program that's on NPR. I can't remember. This American Life, that if you can look up this story, if you go back to their, thank you, if you go back to their website, you can pick up the story on NUMMI. Basically, what happened was that the Fremont plant for General Motors was the worst productive plant in the whole company. They had drugs, alcohol, sex, gambling, everything going on the floor. Things would go down the assembly line. If you couldn't put that part on, you stuffed it in the door, so when it went out to the assembly line and they shut the door to drive it away, it all rattled, and then they had to bring it around the back to come through the line again. That's what was going on there. So General Motors decided to do this thing with Toyota. They sent about over 200 employees from the Fremont plant over to Japan for a couple months and got trained in the Toyota way. They came back. Again, to make a long story short, they made the Fremont plant the most productive in all of General Motors. About a year and a half to 2 years into that, the folks in Detroit said, you know, this is just not the way we do things. And they backed off of it, killed it, didn't go any further than that one plant. Well, we all know what happened in the subsequent 10 years to market share for General Motors. Basically, Toyota ate their lunch. So that's an example of why culture is important. Apple is, I think, going through a very interesting stage in its history and its culture. The founder and the person who created the culture is now gone. There's a new person in there in that spot. He's reforming the culture of the organization. If any of you have kind of followed what's going on there, he's, I think, let 3 or 4 of the top people go. So all that's getting shuffled down sort of below, and the kind of the larger part of the organization, everybody's trying to figure out who's going to end up on top. So there's a lot of reshuffling going on there. Their stock is kind of doing some funny things right now, so Wall Street's kind of recognizing there's a culture change and waiting to see. And there's some other things going on too, but that's a good signal when you see, you know, the Wall Street folks going, "Ooh, what's going on?" And then hospitals. Just right out of the gate here, we have a little bit of a differentiation in terms of organizational type. We're a professionally driven organization, not unlike a university with its faculty. The equivalent of that are the physicians who do not work for a hospital, are not governed by the hospital. They have a separate medical staff that has its own organization and bylaws and all those sorts of things. So you have these people that really kind of drive the business that really aren't part of it. And then we're a service organization. We've talked a lot about manufacturing or printing and those sorts of things. Service organizations are primarily different because the product is created and consumed at the same time. You can't really look at it going down the assembly line. And I guess the other thing is there's just a tremendous amount of variance in what we do. Patients come in the door in all sizes and shapes and in conditions. So those are kind of special elements of hospitals. The other reason that it matters, in particular for healthcare, I think was made reference to by Eric. This is a snapshot of what's happening to the industry by way of the Affordable Health Care Act or healthcare reform. This is, let's see, this is 2009, this is 2019. If you're an organization facing this amount of change, you better be pretty good on that adaptability variable in your culture or you're going to be out of business. There are many people that argue you can't get there incrementally, and I think this is what Eric was making reference to. There's going to have to be a pretty substantial reform, and incremental change probably won't work. We're going to have to come up with new models. So that's another reason why culture matters, I think, in healthcare. So we're going to look real quickly at a case study of a hospital here in California. I've just sort of sanitized it so it's easier to talk about. Founded in the early 60s, it's a district hospital. A district hospital actually has elected board members, so they run in their hospital district and are voted on by the people, and that can make for some very interesting situations in and of itself. Large hospital with 400 beds. The emergency department sees over 80,000 patients annually. It sees over 200 patients per day. It does provide trauma services, and it has air support as well, air transport. The emergency department currently has 32 beds, just added 12 beds about 6 months ago. So they're trying to build their way out of a problem. We'll see later. Just for reference sake, this is the sort of organization structure that has to do with the emergency department. You can imagine a whole box and line chart with all the other departments underneath it. I just wanted to highlight this. The CEO, the CNO is the chief nursing officer, critical care director, and then the ED manager. And I've got the physicians kind of floating free out here because that's kind of what they do. So that's, well, if you're a hospital administrator, it's a challenge, I can tell you that. So, identified problem, average wait time of greater than 2 hours, pressure to increase capacity. The increased demand, which means increased demand for capital. Somebody was talking about that in terms of turnovers and those sorts of things that they could get in the printing. Here we're talking about increased capacity, so they tried to build their way out of a bad process. They added 12 beds, didn't change that at all. So we certainly learned the lesson there. You can't build your way out of a bad process. In fact, you end up wasting a lot of capital. We were in another hospital where we did this, and they were able to delay their capital expansion by 3 years just by improving the process. So the opposite is really true. All that waiting out in front means greater medical risk. Untreated patients waiting in the waiting room. For those of you, I guess all of you, who have been in the emergency room, the standard model is to come in, you're greeted by somebody at a desk who probably then sent you to a nurse who did a little bit of an evaluation on you. They put you back in the waiting room. You waited until you got called into the back. Then maybe they did some registration on you, that sort of thing. So you have patients waiting out in the waiting room. Bad things have happened out in waiting rooms, and some of it's got in the media. You may have seen some of those problems down in LA and other places. I won't go into some of those bad cases. Anyway, there are those. Patient dissatisfaction with long waits. Patients and family members who come back into the emergency room, having waited for a number of hours, tend to have bad attitudes. That doesn't help them clinically. You know, they come to us because they're out of control. Something in their life is out of control. We increase their stress by doing this waiting thing. That doesn't help medically, and it makes things difficult for the staff. And that's why the staff sometimes get this kind of them, us attitude. Decrease the return on investment when productivity is down and limits on volume. So this can end up being a sort of marketing problem for you as well. You lose market share. This is going to be hard for you to read, but or see. This is the emergency department, and it runs all along. Runs along here, and you can see these are little cubicles with beds in them. We're going to come back to this later on. We're going to concentrate on this area here. This is the fast track. Patients come in through here in the waiting room. They go into the fast track, or in this area if they're not too acute and they're going to be discharged from the ED. Here's the trauma area here, and these patients that get to ED Zone 3 are going to be admitted to the hospital. So that's basically the floor plan. That's fairly typical for emergency department. That's kind of a long one. Sometimes they're in pods and different configurations. What we have here are the 3 failed attempts at getting this new process going. And I'm just going to go through this one because it's pretty typical. There's just minor shifts in the subsequent years. But we started in 2006. This says leadership involvement. By that we're talking about the CEO and the CNO. Gave verbal support. We got verbal support from them. Department resistant and disengaged. Site visit, that is going to see this thing someplace else where it's going on. We did do that. I should say the staff was actually rude to the site. You know, they're guests with somebody, and they were visibly resistant on the site visit. Not a good sign. Rules, we didn't have any rules. Level of analysis, participants considered minor changes to their existing plan, no lean techniques. Communications, little if any. Typically, somebody would come into work. Remember, we've got 3 or 4 shifts a day with 25 people on each shift, and a different day, different night, different weekend, different day, different night. So a lot of turnover in staff. So you have a pretty big communication challenge. People would come in, they'd have started this program, they say, well, nobody told me. So you can imagine how it went that day. And then down here, key factors, resistance to change, no leadership on the project. Let's see, I can't get this going. So these subsequent years were about the same thing. We just kind of did some minor tweaks. We'd start this thing, and I think somebody else was talking about, you know when the culture hasn't changed because it starts and it stops. So we'd start this thing and run for a couple of weeks, maybe a month, and then it would just stop. Nobody could really tell why it stopped or how it stopped. It just did. Typically, the nurses would wait for a physician that they know would be sympathetic to a problem they had and say, look, we got a problem today. We can't really do this new thing. And they'd say, stop, and that was it. So, summary of existing environmental factors, lack of visible support from hospital leadership. They thought they knew what needed to be done and that they understood it, and they gave verbal support for it, but they were a no-show as far as their visibility. Inconsistent communication on all levels, inconsistent process. The process depended really on who was on. We probably had 3 or 4 processes a day, let alone day to day. Inconsistent provider understanding and support. Physicians really didn't understand it and didn't support it. They're real leaders. Nurses typically and the rest of the staff will take leadership from the physicians, and if they don't do it, the rest of the folks ain't going to do it either. Nursing preference for current operations. Multiple failed startups. You saw those 3 failed startups. Now we have a credibility problem. We're going to come back a 4th time after we failed 3. So the way we thought about it this last time is really it. This is all we got. Inconsistent leadership in the department. Actually, the last name of the department manager in that first time when we went and they were rude, his last name was Dooms, and I should have known better. I didn't make that up. And he exhibited that kind of attitude. It was embarrassing for me anyway. All right. Hospital administration, as I said before, said believe they understood, and we needed to get a commitment to them to be active participants in this process. Nursing need basic information and active participation in building the new process, need to know how it will benefit them, and actually gave them some telephone numbers of other nurses in other departments who had done this so they could call for references this time around. Provided needed clear expectations and a commitment to this thing. Those are the doctors. Next steps. We met with the CEO. We had a plan together. We had a whole kind of an action plan of what we were going to do, a whole set of communications already drafted for him. He just had to put his name to it, and represented a whole list of risks that they were operating under by not seeing patients more quickly. And we insisted that they attend the second site visit, and they both did. And that was a big driver. We went and visited this hospital. It was about 2/3 the size in terms of the capacity of the emergency department, and they were seeing as many patients and seeing them within that 30-minute time limit that we had set. We had a meeting in that hospital's conference room with the staff that had come along with the CEO and the CNO. The CEO said, is there anybody in here who can tell me why we can't do it at our hospital? There was no answer, and he said, we're going to do it. And that was a big move in moving the culture. It doesn't do it by itself, but what we found, without it, we were really not going to make much progress. The providers saw what was going on. They bought into it. We convened working groups, conduct workflow analysis for specific patients, kind of do the value stream mapping. We agreed on ground rules and goals, set a timetable, adopted a work plan. We met every week for about 4 or 5 months, up to the deadline when we started. We had a macro plan that was kind of the steering committee, was made up of the Cs, and then we had the micro operations plan. These were the folks in the department. So we had both levels kind of covered. Our specific objectives were time to provider, 30 minutes. So from the time you came in and checked in, we had to see you, our provider, our physician had to see you within 30 minutes. Left without being seen. These are patients who come in, check in, and leave, so you don't know where they went, what condition they are. We had at 0.5, the national average is about 3%. So if you move more quickly, you have fewer people walking out the door. In fact, you find that people are calling from other hospitals who are waiting to see what your waiting time is, and they show up, so it actually attracts business. Obvious patient satisfaction issues, core measures of quality measures. We set some quality measures. We set a start date here. We had a communication plan at all levels, and we structured and we got approval for training programs, paid training programs for all people. All the staff in the department, from the housekeeping staff to nurses to doctors, everybody, to learn about what it was we were talking about, why we're going to do it, what the benefits were, all those sorts of things. So just to give you a sample of who was in this micro working group, we had ED staff, doctors, that's me, the practice management consultant, pharmacy, lab, imaging, admitting, security, transport, housekeeping, marketing, communications, the whole team. Those are the folks who were meeting every week for about 5-6 months. We had two teams, a workflow team and a communication team. We developed a plan for dry runs. This is to take our new plan. We had people play patients and started them coming in the door. We went all through the process through our map. We had timed dry runs. Those are very helpful in refining our process before we started. That's been something that I've done in a number of situations, found particularly helpful in a process that's very complex. We also had a plan for controlling adaptation. Because you know your first run is not going to be right. You're going to have to make some adaptations. How do you control that so that it doesn't get out of hand? If you don't, it changes every day, and when people come in, they just don't know what's going on, so you have to plan for that. And then I think the other important thing is we had these operational rules. The process cannot be stopped without talking to the ED manager or the medical director. Nobody can stop it unless they talk to either of those two people, and they don't want to talk to that, so they keep it going. But they actually had a couple of assistant managers come in and started on their own. They came in, it was really crowded. They went in and they started pulling patients back, and they had a good experience, and they were two young, very strong assistant managers. So in this last version in 2011, we had verbal and visible support from the leadership. They took ownership, and so did the department leaders. Site visit, we did that. And I believe a picture is worth 1,000 words. And just like the other fellow, I wasn't too convinced that going someplace else to see it was going to make a difference. It makes a big difference, especially somebody who's got fewer resources. To wit, well, let's just keep going. Let's see. Rules, we had rules. You saw those. Levels of analysis. Department leadership uses lean concepts to design and redesign flow process. And we use time studies. We got a lot of communication, key factors that we've already talked about. I'll keep moving here because I want to. This again is the ED floor plan. Okay, so the ED manager, when he came back from the site visit, drew up a plan that had the waiting room as this sort of triage area. It had cubicles all in here. And he looked at that, and then he said, I don't think that's going to work. Let me draw this one. That was a critical move, too. He had his ego sort of invested in this first version, and he was able to get over that and see, hey, there's a better way, and let's move to that. I'm not tied to this thing. And so this is what we ended up doing here. This is the area fast track that is this area, the intake zone. We doubled the number of spaces that the patients are treated in. In here, they're all beds. These are all chairs. These little hash marks out here are all chairs, so we had a lot of treatment chairs. We added about 24 patient treatment areas with these treatment chairs. So the idea is instead of taking care of the patient sequentially, we do things in parallel. Somebody needs to go get a lab, they go to the lab and they come back, and they don't go back out to the waiting room, they wait in one of these areas, and if the patient's of low acuity, the nurse will come up to the patient in the treatment chair and say, the good thing is we know you have a UTI, here's your orders, you're gone. There's a whole bed psychology in hospitals. Once a patient gets in the bed, they kind of want to own it. The staff kind of want to let them be there. If you've got a room with a bed and a patient in it, and the patient's stable, your workload's less. So sometimes they've been known to sit on patients, so to speak. This is a detail of the flow plan that we had to work up for walk-in patients. These are patients that come through the front door. You can see how complex it is. And just wanted you to kind of get the visual. These are for patients who come in by ambulance. So you have all these different pathways for patients. Comparing models. Just want to do this one real quick. The standard model is staff-driven. The new model is patient-driven. Where does admitting take place? In the admitting department? No, it takes place wherever the patient is. So we had admitting people with computers on wheels follow patients around and do the admitting stuff wherever they could. And that was kind of the operational value. How can we keep moving the patients? We'll move with the patients. The waiting room, we have two kinds of waiting. Non-productive waiting, that's waiting out in the waiting room. And productive waiting, that's waiting inside in those treatment areas. Something's happening. People are waiting out in the waiting room, nothing's happening for them. Full triage, where that was the real choke point on the original model, where patients would get triaged by a nurse out front. That would stop everything back up. They had a pretty sophisticated and expensive e-tracking board, big ones up in the department. Nobody could keep track of those things. It was hard to keep them updated. The new one used these little flags that would go up and down. And you could look across the top of the flags and you tell the status of the department just like that. Somebody else was talking about that concept in their presentation, keeping track of what's going on. So the e-tracking thing was, notwithstanding the expense of it, was really of little use, but just these little colored flags was the way to keep track of patients. The old model was all patients in beds, and once we got all patients in bed and all the beds are full, it all backed up into the waiting room. Here, we minimize bed use. We use treatment chairs, keep patients moving. Those that can go in 30 minutes, go in 30 minutes. We concentrate on taking those patients out and getting them out rather than letting them sit. As I mentioned before, there was a linear process before, now multiple parallel process. Operating plan varies with shift to shift on the standard plan. Set of rules for all. Functions have fixed locations. Well, I mentioned that before. Functions can be moved depending on where the patients are. Conclusion, culture matters, ignored at your own risk. I would say a cultural assessment. I had made an assessment the first time, the first year we tried it, that the leadership was not involved, but for a number of reasons we weren't able to deal with that actually until the fourth time because they thought they knew what was going on. And have a plan for cultural change, just like you have a plan for workflow.
Was it the same C-level group?
Yep. Yeah.
Have they ever acknowledged?
One time they said, at one time they actually threw me out. Oh, the question is, was it the same leadership team throughout on the CEO, CNO level? Yes, it was. And one of the passes, I was asked to leave because they were going to do it their way. So we had some ups and downs.
We have time for some
Questions?
questions.
So, point is, we can reform operations in healthcare. It is very complex. Culture matters. Culture has evolved over a long time in hospitals, and it's going to take some concentrated effort to get that to change. Because people, yes?
Do you see any movement in the, I'm just going to use the word attitude of the doctors? You have them floating out there. Our county has hospitals. We have our hospital administrator. Also is
Sure.
for that. They have their own culture. Do you see any movement now that you've had some great results?
What I would say, you got to find somebody in that group who's a lead. Oh, the question is, do you see any change in the attitudes of physicians as sort of the independent actors? Yes, because there's this larger change going on, and I think you have to address it just like you would any other group trying to deal with cultural change. You know, if you're dealing with a faculty senate at a university, you know, try to find a leader, somebody whose opinion is respected, help them come along with this thing, understand the benefits, and try to get them to spread the news, if you will. Yeah, it's not complicated, but it's time-consuming, sometimes frustrating. Yeah. Yes?
What have you put in place to ensure the sustaining of the change?
There is a kind of a monitoring group that meets infrequently now, maybe once a quarter. We have metrics in on all those measures we were talking about. Remember, time to provider in 30 minutes and all that sort of stuff. So we have a dashboard where we measure that across time. And then there's the rules. And those rules ensure that the process is being done consistently. But we have monthly dashboard statistics that report on those rules and the process that we're trying to accomplish. Our patient satisfaction's gone up. It always does when we do this. The market share of the hospital goes up because word gets out by word of mouth and people start coming from other places. They'll drive for long distance because they don't get seen and gone. So we look for market share, we look for time to provider, we look for patient satisfaction, we look at the quality measures. Yes?
So what's next? How do you take off the next big bite out of the cheese?
The next big bite really is how patients get from the department up to the floor, because sometimes we get a backup because now the floor nurses are doing their standard model, and then it backs up into the department. Now we have less capacity. So that's even more complicated in the emergency department, believe it or not, getting the nursing floors, surgical floors, all those folks to change how they do things and move things more quickly. But that's it. It's throughput, basically. Yeah. Just one finishing statistic. Somewhere north of 60% of patients that come to emergency department are not emergent. And in the new model, the real plan is not to have those people show up, have access in other places. More docs. Thank you.